My name is Eric Dawson. I am with an organization that is a not-for-profit organization in New York City called Nuclear New York. Our mission is to preserve and hopefully expand nuclear power in New York State specifically, because we believe that it is a necessary technology to reduce carbon emissions in the long term. If anybody's joining us, I'll keep reminding everybody, please keep your audio on mute. And we thought that we would use a policy today. If you have any questions, we hope you do, please just type it in the chat box. And Dietmar will field questions at the end during our Q&A. So again, my name's Eric Dawson. My background is in web development. I've been a web developer in New York for several years. And a little while ago, I became more interested in clean tech investing and finding nonpartisan practical solutions to various social problems, specifically environmental problems. And I happened on this issue of nuclear power. And it's something that I never really thought of before. And I thought that it was largely absent from the public debates about energy policy. And then the more I read, then the more I realized that this can really be a bridge to a much cleaner world. We really need nuclear. So having said that, I'm going to give my presentation, and I apologize if there's some technical difficulties here. Let's see. Okay. Does that look good? Yeah? Okay. So again, we are Nuclear New York, and to celebrate Climate Week, we want to give a presentation on the benefits of nuclear power as for the environment. I'm going to be giving a presentation more on broad brush strokes about the general issues, and then my partner Yusru will talk more specifically about New York State and New York City. We're going to start off with a clip from a documentary that we all highly recommend called Juice, How Electricity Explains the World. And it really talks about how available electricity on a grid is really the foundation for having anything else in society that we want and that we take for granted. This is an Australian environmentalist, Ben Hurd, talking about the importance of electricity.
If people have a choice between either no energy and dirty energy, they will take dirty energy every time. So if we start trading off the need to reduce carbon emissions with the need for human development, that need for human development has to win. I was raised in the environmental school of thought that was telling me the world was getting worse. And then I hit my 30s and started doing my own research and realized, actually, on so many metrics, the world has got better. We're just stuck in an energy paradox, that the energy that's helping us make the world get better has this horrible side effect. Well, let's get rid of the side effect. Let's not get rid of the energy. When you can marry dense fuel, and particularly electricity, with human ingenuity, we can do nearly anything.
So in the 21st century, in first world developed countries, we are the heirs to great wealth and we have become spoiled. And so it's hard to reflect on what income really means, what wealth means, what GDP per capita means when we compare different countries. But probably the simplest way to put it is as electricity increases, human labor decreases. And there are different ways to quantify this. But the common metric that is used is kilowatt hours per person per year. Again, just to reiterate, electricity frees up human labor, and this reduces the time that people spend in marginal daily activities in large swaths of the world, doing things like carrying water, carrying wood, providing light in the evening for reading, to further education, studying, which has ripple effects later on in terms of economic development. And these simple basics that we take for granted are really the stepping stones to having a better life and participating in the modern global economy. So there are different ways to quantify how advanced societies are and how much electricity is available to the average person. Again, the most common metric that you see in comparing countries is kilowatt hours per person. And so right here, this is a chart that shows by orders of magnitude, if you're below 1,000 kilowatt hours per person, we would consider that to really be a mark of absolute poverty. And the goal for large swaths of the world, again, is to get above 1,000. In the US and several other first world countries, we're actually above 10,000 kilowatt hours per person. I believe at this point in the 21st century, all high income countries are at least 4,000, which is around here. But really the marker of absolute poverty is in the 3 digits if you're below 1,000. There are a lot of large countries that have an average metric of below 1,000 kilowatt hours, places like Pakistan, Nigeria, Bangladesh, Ethiopia, Philippines, Vietnam, the Congo. And these countries suffer disproportionately from what we would call diseases of poverty, things like tuberculosis and malaria, cholera, malnutrition, things that are largely absent in the 21st century developed nations and have been for about a century. So if we think about this electricity as a metric for comparing development, we can look at a world map of, again, electricity consumption per capita. And we see that the Western world and Western Europe and North America and Oceania is very high. But so are a number of Middle Eastern countries right here, the rich Arab countries like UAE and Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, but also Eastern Europe and Asia. They have also caught up, and a lot of Latin America as well. Africa is still lacking, but a lot of the world has really caught up in terms of electricity. But although electricity is foundational, it's not the only metric to really evaluate quality of life. And there's a lot of controversies about the subjectivity of what is quality of life and that we view it through a Western lens. But, if enough people want to live the quality of life that we see in this country and we want to bring that to them, then the question is, okay, how do we do that? How do we evaluate that? So if we look at the map, you can see, again, large swaths of the world have high electricity. But then when we look at a map of particulate matter in the air, of soot, of air pollution, we see that this is what differentiates really the Western countries from the richer Middle Eastern countries and the becoming richer and richer Asian countries. That we have very little comparatively little air pollution in North America, in Western Europe, and in Australia and New Zealand, as opposed to the Middle East and Asia. And the question is, well, we all use electricity. Why is this? It is because of the source of the electricity, that they use a much larger percentage of fossil fuels in the Middle East and Asia as opposed to in the West. So when we, again, think about this in terms of how it adds up with quality of life, there's a number of different definitions, but there are different teams of economists and scientists that have come together and tried to quantify quality of life and not limit themselves to just electricity or just income, but also thinking of unemployment, of education, of health, of civil liberties, of freedom of speech, of crime, of social support, and of course pollution. So one of the organizations that has done this is called the Social Progress Index, where it combines a bunch of these metrics into one. And so we see, again, the Western countries fare the best, and less so in the Middle East and Asia, even if they are climbing the charts in terms of money and electricity. And so I was interested in this, and so I put together 2 of the common lists of countries. There are a number of these indices. One of the most popular ones from a few years ago is called the World Happiness Index, but it's based mostly on self-reported surveys. So I took 2 of the indices that are based more on hard numbers, on different metrics about life expectancy, things like that. One is the OECD Better Life Index, and then the other is the Social Progress Index, whose map I just showed. These are the top 20 countries from the most recent years that they've quantified from both lists, and you see a lot of repeats. Specifically, you see the Nordic countries of Northern Europe, you see Switzerland, you also see Canada, our great neighbors to the north, and Australia and New Zealand. And so if we see which countries overlap, we have a list of 18 countries, and guess what? The majority of them use nuclear power. And we don't think this is a coincidence that the places that use the highest amount of energy with the least amount of air pollution happen to use nuclear in the mix. And even if you look at the countries at the bottom that do not have nuclear, a number of them have the great fortune to have a very low population combined with a very large natural resource of renewable energy that actually works. So none of them get a majority from solar and wind, but famously, Norway gets the majority of its electricity from hydro. I think it might be actually 99%, which is amazing. And New Zealand and Iceland have very high quantities of both hydro and geothermal, so they also get a majority of their electricity from renewables. But all these places have populations below 10 million, and they're blessed to have these resources. So, you know, nuclear may not apply to them, but they're outliers. We think that if most of the world wants to improve their electricity availability while reducing pollution, then nuclear really has to be a part of the mix in the end. And just to take home the point, nuclear is not only in France or the US, it's actually in over 30 countries. This particular map says 30. The United Arab Emirates recently added a plant to this list. So I think it's probably 31 at this point. But you see the patterns again of Western Europe and North America, but there are other places too. The biggest growth of nuclear power has been in Asia recently. But you also see the legacy of that in Eastern Europe and in Latin America too. And so with that in mind, and this is something that I'm very interested in, is looking for solutions that actually work. And we need to identify real problems and develop real solutions that you know, can work in the real world. And so I feel, and a lot of people in our organization feel, that the environmentalist movement tends to ask sometimes unproductive questions, and I would encapsulate this as the question, what is utopia? And of course, utopia is we all live forever without any pollution and any sickness and any conflict, and everything would be great. But it's hard to kind of snap your fingers and get there. And so I think that the better question to ask is, if I can get there, is would you rather? If you remember this game that you play when you're a kid, you think of two equally unpleasant situations. Oh, would you rather be shot or stabbed? And you try to, you know, debate, okay, which is worse? Because the bottom line is that any energy policy will have negative externalities. There'll always be a cost-benefit analysis. There'll always be pros and cons. And economists usually word it as compared to what? Whatever policy you choose, there'll always be an opportunity cost. There'll always be negative externalities. Everything is compared to something else. And so to phrase it more precisely and not kind of put the blinders on just one issue, in particular carbon emissions, the problem is not simply to reduce carbon emissions. And that's how it's often worded in the public sphere of debate. But rather, we want to reduce carbon emissions while continuing to increase quality of life. And not just for rich people or in certain countries, we would like to increase the quality of life for everyone without increasing carbon emissions. That is really the name of the game. And the other part of the public discussion that I think is often glazed over is that energy sourcing is non-binary. That it is often phrased, again, in media, there's clean energy and dirty energy. And we could say more specifically, fossil fuels and renewable. But we believe that it should actually be worded as three categories: fossil, renewable, and nuclear. Nuclear, if we're being straight up about this, it is neither fossil fuel nor is it renewable. But we think that it is actually the best of both worlds because it offers the reliability and efficiency of fossil fuels, but the absence of both carbon emissions and air pollution that's found with renewables. And so we can't simply get rid of fossil fuels. We can't snap our fingers. We have to actually displace fossil fuels through substitution. And if you look at the world mix of electricity right now, given this three category paradigm, we have a majority still using fossil fuels for electricity. We have a minority using renewables, and we have a smaller minority using nuclear. And you'll notice that 20 years ago, we actually were using a greater percentage of nuclear worldwide. And in recent years, this has decreased. We think that this is a great mistake, because we think that given current technology, most renewable that exists is either exhausted or has a low ceiling of development in terms of scalability. But nuclear has the potential to expand. And that is what will actually displace fossil fuels, especially coal. That's really the theme of this today, is that we can't simply get rid of coal. We can't simply ban it. And if you look in the history of this country in the past 20 years, the displacement of coal has come from the expansion of gas. And we don't like gas, we just like it better than coal. And so if we want to have a solution to displace gas, we have to expand something that's better than gas, and we have that in nuclear. So yeah, as I said, we cannot displace fossil fuels, or we cannot simply disappear fossil fuels, we need to displace them. And the answer, we think, is with nuclear. So if we get into the energy mix or electricity mix of the US, we see that we still get a majority from fossil fuels, about, what is this, about 25, 30% from coal, and roughly equivalent of gas. Gas is slowly displacing coal, but it is far from doing it completely. And then the non-carbon sources include nuclear, but also include hydro, wind, solar, and other renewables like biomass. Nuclear right now accounts for about 20% of electricity, and we would just like that to only increase. You know, let's get it up to 30%. If we look at carbon emissions, this is a very clear picture that the vast majority of carbon emissions come from coal, and to a lesser extent gas. So yet again, the name of the game is, how can we displace coal, and then how can we displace gas? We need to expand an alternative. We can't simply ban it. We can't simply wish it weren't there. It is there. We need to replace it. People want a high quality of life for themselves, usually higher than their parents, and they want their children to have higher quality of life. The population is not decreasing, it is only increasing. We need an alternative. Another issue that we like to bring up is that, again, carbon emissions are at the forefront of the discussion, which makes sense. But we like to also bring up air pollution, as I did at the beginning. But one issue that is often ignored in popular media is land use intensity. And that if you quantify energy sources, not by one arbitrary total, but a ratio of per energy unit, per kilowatt hour, per terawatt hour. If you quantify land use per terawatt hour, nuclear actually comes out better than not only other renewables, but better than fossil fuels. And this leads into other forms of environmentalism that have kind of taken a backseat over the past 10 years with a focus on carbon emissions, of things like conservation of forests, conservation of wildlife. And this is important for quality of life issues and a more holistic view of the environment. Another metric to think about is the material intensity for every energy source. And so yet again, if you compare to renewables, nuclear uses less concrete, less steel, less other materials for the amount of electricity that you get in an exchange. And so this is the more big picture way of viewing and comparing and contrasting different energy sources that we want to encourage more people to delve into. But of course, there are some objections, and we want to be transparent again in saying that there are negative externalities and there are risks with every energy policy we could have. So two of the most common ones are a risk of an accident at a nuclear power plant and what to do about long-term waste storage. Just to give you a bigger picture, nuclear has been around for 2 generations. It's been around since the 1950s, over 60 years. It now exists in over 400 plants. I believe the number is 440 is the most recent number, in over 30 countries around the world, on many different continents. And there have only been 3 major accidents. So again, we're talking about 3 accidents out of over 400 plants over the course of 60 years. 2 of those accidents have resulted in zero direct deaths. And that would be 3 Mile Island and Fukushima. The kind of elephant in the room that we don't want to sidestep is Chernobyl. And obviously, in the last year, there was the miniseries that came out about Chernobyl. And this scared a lot of people away from nuclear power, and it's kind of in the popular mindset of people who are making these evaluations. But our argument is that if you look at the totality of evidence over the past 60 years across various continents, different kinds of countries that have different kinds of governments, on the whole, this is actually the safest form of energy if you take into account all the information. And really the tragedy of Chernobyl is more of an indictment of the Soviet system and less so about nuclear power. And even, you know, the strongest evidence is just that a few years after Chernobyl, the country fell apart, literally. So that should tell you something about how it was run. But there weren't fail-safe mechanisms put into place. And we also think that just the authoritarian nature of the society, without as much freedom of speech, without as much powers given to whistleblowers to alert authorities, these are the things that can introduce danger in a variety of areas. And in addition, the RBMK reactor that was used in Chernobyl would have been illegal in any other country at the time. So it's kind of apples and oranges. Like Chernobyl is really like an outlier. But we include this when we think of deaths per energy unit. And even if we do that, I mean, less than 50 deaths compared with millions of lives that have been saved through cheap, clean energy, it's like a no-brainer. It's no comparison. The other issue is storage, long-term storage. Right now, most nuclear waste is kept in thick concrete casts above ground in the US. In the future, most will likely be moved beneath the surface. But a common quote that we like to say is, if you added up all of the nuclear waste that has ever been produced in the US over 60 years, it could fit in one football field. And you think of a football field as being, you know, big compared to a person, but you think of it in terms of, you know, how small this is compared to a city or a state, let alone a country. This is actually very small. It's very easily managed. It's actually not a big risk. And only nuclear energy in this country is required to account for all of its waste by the Department of Energy. Some people don't realize the Department of Energy should really be called the Department of Nuclear Energy. It was created in the 1970s specifically to regulate nuclear energy. So there's no lack of safety mechanisms for nuclear right now. And again, we have to ask, compared to what? Would you rather? And so when you add up deaths per terawatt hour, per kilowatt hour, we get a graph that looks like this. When you compare that, nuclear is better than all the fossil fuels. The deadliest is coal. And again, that is our main message. We need alternatives to displace coal. But this was actually from a study done in 2007, comparing deaths per electricity unit. But there was a study done just a few years ago in 2016 that it actually even did higher estimates of Chernobyl deaths, including potential cancer deaths, which are more controversial because it's hard to, you know, be precise with causality. But even compared with renewables, you see down here, this 2016 study on nuclear showed that it was safer compared to even solar and wind. It's hard to believe, but when you actually crunch the numbers and you really compare, again, per energy unit, and you include things like workers falling off of roofs when they're installing solar panels, things like that, nuclear is actually the safest form of energy. So that is really our main message. This is the graph that matters most. If you are compelled to share this information with other people, I would encourage you to share the deaths per energy unit. There's a great one here at ourworldinenergy.org. There are others on the internet. But nuclear ultimately has saved more lives than it has taken by far. And even to shorten it and put a nice little bow on the end, nuclear saves lives. That is really our message. So with that, I wanted to transition to another clip from another documentary. Just so you know, the first documentary is called Juice, on the importance of electricity and how nuclear power can hook up to an electric grid. There's another documentary we recommend called Pandora's Promise, again, talking about all the arguments for and against nuclear. And the most famous American spokesman for nuclear power is Michael Shellenberger. His organization is called Environmental Progress. So this is a clip, hopefully you'll be able to see, on this issue of safety, of deaths per energy unit. This is just a couple minutes.
One of the big surprises for me when I started looking into the mortality data, the death rates associated with each energy technology per amount of energy they make, is that nuclear is the second safest after wind. And in fact, to add to the irony of it, nuclear power is even safer than solar panels. Making solar panels is an incredibly toxic process. But I mean, I thought that people died at 3 Mile Island. I thought that hundreds of thousands of people died at Chernobyl. I thought that there was nuclear waste scattered all around the country and that it was seeping into our water systems. I believed all that stuff, and I thought even if maybe it was getting a little bit better, or maybe if the problems of it were exaggerated a little bit by my fellow environmentalists, that it was still a risk that we didn't need to take.
There hasn't been a single death from the operation of commercial nuclear reactors in the United States. Not one death in the history of nuclear power in this country. At Vermont Yankee, which anti-nuclear people are trying to shut down, protesters keep saying it's causing public health problems. It's not.
But it's leaking tritium.
It's leaking tritium, that's true.
Banana breaks? Oh, I love one. Sure. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
If you ate one banana,
Banana breaks?
which have a potassium isotope that's a little hot, you would get more radiation exposure
Banana breaks?
than you would if you drank all the water that comes out of the plant in one day.
Banana break!
Tritium bearing hydrogen isotope.
We're going to...
The clip always makes me hungry. But with that, I will hand it off to my partner Isru, and he will talk more specifically about our situation in real time in New York State and New York City, where Indian Point is in danger of being shut down next year. So thanks very much.